In the spring of 1943, as Allied forces prepared for the long push to reclaim the continent, and as Europe remained shackled beneath the boot of Nazi occupation, a different kind of mission was taking shape across the English countryside, one born not of brute force, but of precision, ingenuity, and audacity. The air over Britain pulsed with activity. The Royal Air Force, hardened by years of punishing combat over Europe, was poised for something entirely new. An operation so daring, so precise, that even its conception bordered on the fantastical. At the heart of this mission lay a target far beyond the reach of conventional air power, a trio of massive stone and concrete dams buried deep in western Germany in the Ruhr Valley. The Möhne, Eder, and Sorpe dams were no ordinary structures. They were towering symbols of German engineering might, vast leviathans holding back millions of tons of water. The reservoirs they contained were not just scenic lakes. They were arteries feeding the industrial heart of the Nazi war machine. Their waters powered hydroelectric stations that lit up steel foundries and munitions factories. They cooled furnaces, drove turbines, and quenched the thirst of hundreds of thousands. They sustained war. They fueled conquest. To destroy them would be to strike a blow not merely against infrastructure, but against the very rhythm of the Reich's war economy. The water would surge into the valley, tearing through towns, factories, and rail lines. Lives would be lost. But beyond the physical damage, the psychological toll could be devastating. A strike like this would show that even the innermost sanctums of the German homeland, once thought invulnerable, could be reached. It would shake morale from the factory floor to the halls of command. Yet these dams were anything but soft targets. The Möhne and Eder dams were flanked by steep, winding valley walls that made conventional bombing approaches nearly impossible. Anti-aircraft emplacements ringed the perimeters, and more crucially, torpedo nets stretched across the surface of the reservoirs, designed to thwart underwater charges and protect against aquatic sabotage. Conventional bombing from high altitude had already proven ineffective. Previous raids had left only minor scars. The dam faces were thick and curved, designed to deflect blasts and withstand nature's fury. No weapon in the Allied arsenal could touch them. Unless something new could be devised, something unprecedented. That something came in the form of an unlikely figure. Barnes Wallis, a bespectacled, eccentric engineer with a mind unbound by convention. Wallis was not a military man, but his intellect and passion made him a force of nature. He had already contributed to aviation design, but his newest obsession was bolder still. Wallis proposed a bomb that didn't drop, but skipped. Inspired by the simple mechanics of a child skipping a stone across a pond, he envisioned a cylindrical weapon that could be spun backwards and released low over water. It would bounce across the surface, avoiding torpedo nets until it reached the dam. There, it would sink, hugging the wall and detonate at depth, just as a depth charge would, sending a massive shockwave into the dam's base. The resulting pressure could rupture even reinforced concrete. To his peers, it seemed like madness, but Wallis had calculations, models, and conviction. His prototypes, tested in secret on reservoirs in England, performed well. The weapon would be known as upkeep. It had to be dropped at exactly 60 feet of altitude, at a speed of 220 miles per hour, and at a precise distance from the target. There was no margin for error. Miss the speed, the altitude, the angle, the bomb would either overshoot, sink prematurely, or miss entirely. This wasn't brute bombing. This was a surgeon's stroke, delivered by aircraft at night, deep inside enemy territory, under fire. And so the plan was approved. Operation Chastise was born. Wallis's invention alone was not enough. The delivery system had to be reimagined. For this, the RAF turned to number. 617 Squadron, a brand-new unit formed solely for the mission. Hand-picked from across Bomber Command, The squadron's pilots, navigators, and gunners were some of the finest airmen in Britain. Many had flown dozens of sorties. Some were barely out of school. All would be pushed to their limits. Leading them was Wing Commander Guy Gibson, a 24-year-old veteran with more than 170 operations under his belt. Charismatic, fiercely disciplined, and utterly determined, Gibson was a man with a rare blend of courage and calculation. He knew the odds, he knew the risks, but he also knew the stakes. Failure would mean not only death for his men, but the loss of one of the war's most daring opportunities. Training began in April 1943 at RAF Scampton and other airfields in Lincolnshire. Crews flew low-level practice runs over English lakes and reservoirs, often at night, often in silence. They dropped dummy bombs, timed their approaches, and practiced the treacherous maneuvering needed to fly heavy Avro Lancaster bombers at treetop level. The aircraft themselves were modified, turrets removed, internal structures changed, and specially calibrated altimeters and bomb sights installed. The upkeep bomb was so large it had to be mounted partially outside the fuselage, rotating backwards as it hung beneath the bomber's belly. Night after night, the crews rehearsed, skimming over the water at 100 feet, dodging trees, towers, and hills. Some found the challenge exhilarating. Others quietly feared the odds were too great. Everyone understood the reality. Flying in darkness at low altitude, deep into the Reich, would expose them to intense flak, fighters, and mechanical failure. Casualties were expected. Many would not return. By May, the mission was set. Final briefings were held behind locked doors. Crews were told of their targets: Möhne, Eder, Sorpa. Models of the dams were revealed, routes were plotted. Every crew member knew exactly what was expected of them. There would be no backup squadron, no second wave. This was it. And so, on the evening of May 16, 1943, under fading twilight, 19 Lancasters lifted off from RAF Scampton. They flew in small groups, spread out to reduce the chance of interception. Each carried a single upkeep bomb. The crews joked nervously, sang songs, or sat in silence as the coast of England faded behind them and the dark waters of the North Sea stretched ahead. They flew low, so low they could see the waves beneath them and the silhouettes of startled cattle in fields as they passed over the Dutch coast. Operation Chastise was underway. What lay ahead was a night of heroism and heartbreak. Some planes would be lost before reaching Germany. Others would be shot down over the targets. But some would make it through. And when they did, the very walls of Hitler's fortress would tremble, not from brute force, but from a singular act of imagination, courage, and precision. Delivering such a revolutionary weapon, a bouncing bomb that needed to skip across water, evade defenses, and detonate against the submerged face of a dam, was not a task for ordinary crews or standard tactics. It required a kind of flying that bordered on lunacy. Low-level, nighttime navigation over hostile territory, through mountainous terrain and flak-filled skies, at speeds and altitudes that left no margin for error. This wasn't just about piloting skill. It was about courage, grit, and absolute precision. The Royal Air Force knew that success would demand a specialized unit. And so, in March 1943, from the quiet fields of Lincolnshire, No. 617 Squadron was born. Officially, it was just another squadron in Bomber Command. In truth, it was anything but. Conceived in secrecy, assembled in haste, and forged under extraordinary pressure, 617 would become one of the most elite and legendary units in aviation history. At its helm was Wing Commander Guy Gibson, a man whose youth masked a staggering depth of experience. At just 24 years old, he had already flown more than 170 combat missions, raids over Germany, night operations, and perilous sorties that had earned him a reputation for boldness and brilliance. He was respected by his superiors, admired by his peers, and trusted by the men under his command. He was also intense, demanding, and obsessed with discipline. But above all, he was unshakably loyal to his crews. He didn't ask his men to do anything he wouldn't do himself. That alone won their devotion. Gibson knew the odds. He knew that what was being asked of them, what they were training for, was unlike anything ever attempted in the history of warfare. They were to fly deep into Germany at night, in heavy bombers stripped down for speed and maneuverability. They would descend into narrow valleys flanked by flak batteries and hills, and then, at exactly the right moment, they would release a weapon that had never been used in combat, at an altitude that could not be measured by normal instruments. The training was relentless. Over the still lakes and reservoirs of northern England and Scotland, the Lancasters flew again and again. Their crews practiced night flying at low altitudes, skimming above treetops and water with less than 100 feet of clearance beneath their wings. Dummy bombs were dropped. Approach angles were calculated. Every mission was a rehearsal for a one-time performance, one that could not be repeated. To ensure the bomb was released at exactly 60 feet, no higher, no lower, a simple but ingenious method was devised. Each Lancaster was fitted with 2 spotlights, one angled forward, the other downward. When the aircraft reached the correct altitude, the beams would intersect on the water's surface to form a perfect circle. It was a visual cue, a glowing bullseye that told the bomb aimer when the aircraft was at the right height. But maintaining that height, at night, under fire, in an aircraft traveling at over 200 miles per hour would require nerves of steel. There were crashes during training. Pilots were lost. Some aircraft were damaged by sudden downdrafts, misjudged maneuvers, or clipped trees during low-level runs. But still, the crews pushed themselves. They had volunteered for this mission not for fame or reward, but because they understood what it meant. A successful strike could cripple the Ruhr Valley, damage German war production, and prove that innovation and bravery could outmatch brute force. And then, on the afternoon of May 16, 1943, the word came down: Operation Chastise was greenlit. The weather was holding. The moon would offer partial illumination. The dams were full after a wet spring. Everything was aligned. Crews were gathered for final briefings. The secrecy was finally peeled back. Models of the targets, the Möhne, Eder, and Sorpe dams, were displayed. Routes were revealed. Risks were acknowledged. Some crews would fly north, skimming across the North Sea toward the Dutch coast, then curving south into Germany. Others would approach from different angles to divide enemy attention and reduce the chance of mass interception. By early evening, final checks were underway at RAF Scampton. Ground crews swarmed over the black-painted Lancasters, making last-minute adjustments, securing the massive cylindrical bombs that hung beneath the aircraft like great iron barrels. These were no ordinary munitions. Officially designated upkeep, the bombs were marvels of wartime engineering, spinning drums that, when released at speed and at the correct altitude, would bounce across the surface of the water like skipping stones. They were filled with over 6,000 pounds of Torpex explosive and timed to detonate underwater, maximizing the shockwave against the dam walls. The bombs were spun by electric motors at 500 revolutions per minute, a delicate balance of weight, force, and trajectory. But because of the size and complexity of the upkeep bomb, the aircraft themselves had been modified extensively. The Lancasters, known officially as Type 464 Provisionals, had undergone radical changes. Their bomb bays were rebuilt to cradle the bomb's rotating mechanism. Internal armor and turrets were stripped to reduce weight. Even the crews were trimmed to essentials: pilot, flight engineer, navigator, bomb aimer, wireless operator, and 2 gunners. There was room for nothing more. Fuel loads were limited. The aircraft would carry just enough to reach the targets, complete the bombing run, and return, assuming they weren't forced to divert or engage in extended combat. The margin for error was razor thin. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the airfield came alive. Engines began to growl. Propellers spun into motion. The first aircraft taxied toward the runway, its navigation lights glowing faintly in the deepening dusk. The mood among the crews was quiet, focused, intense. They checked their watches. They tightened their harnesses. Some prayed. Others simply stared out into the fading light, knowing full well that for some, this would be their last takeoff. At 9:28 p.m., the first wave of Lancasters roared into the sky, climbing briefly before descending to treetop level. The others followed, spaced in staggered groups to avoid detection and allow for independent attack vectors. 19 aircraft in total, 19 bombs, 19 crews flying into darkness on the edge of a weapon's dream. Behind them, RAF Scampton fell silent once more. Ahead lay flak, fighters, valleys, and history. The most audacious bombing raid of the Second World War was underway. At precisely 21:30 hours inside a dimly lit operations room at RAF Scampton, the final briefings were delivered. The crews of No. 617 Squadron stood clustered around maps and models, eyes scanning the layout of their targets, the Möhne, the Eder, and the Sorpe dams. These weren't just walls of concrete. They were the arteries of Germany's industrial heartland. Breach them, and the Ruhr Valley would flood. Hydroelectric power would vanish. Factories would fall silent. Rail lines would be washed away. And perhaps most importantly, Nazi morale would take a thunderous hit. But success came at a cost. The dams were heavily defended. Flak guns ringed the approaches. The valleys acted as funnels, exposing any aircraft that ventured into their embrace. The Sorpe Dam, built with an earth embankment, was even tougher. It would require a direct hit, not just proximity. The crews knew what they were up against. Losses were expected, and yet no one stepped back. As the sun dipped below the western horizon, casting long shadows over the Lincolnshire fields, the engines of 19 specially modified Avro Lancasters began to growl. Each aircraft, marked with its unique call sign, beginning with AJ, was loaded with a single massive upkeep bomb. Spinning in its cradle, it was armed and waiting. At takeoff, the planes looked heavier than air should allow. Dark. Silhouettes with wings wide and bellies full of destruction. One by one, the Lancasters lifted off into the deepening twilight, climbing briefly before leveling out low, shockingly low. Within minutes, they were flying over the English countryside at altitudes so low that treetops flashed by like brush strokes, hedges blurred into green smears, barn roofs passed within feet, church spires were dodged like street lamps. They were now ghosts in the night, too low for radar, too fast for a second chance. The squadron had been split into 3 groups. The first wave, consisting of 9 aircraft, was tasked with striking the Möhne and Eder dams, the primary targets. The second wave, 5 aircraft, would go for the Sorp. The final wave, the reserve group, was to head in last, prepared to strike any target left standing or reinforce the others as needed. Each wave took a different route across the North Sea, then through Holland and into Germany. Every path was chosen with care to avoid known flak concentrations, but the Luftwaffe had a long memory and a brutal reach. Trouble began almost immediately. Not long after crossing the coast, AJA, flown by Flight Sergeant Kenneth Townsend, suffered a malfunction with its bomb sight and power systems. With heavy heart, Townsend was forced to turn back, his Lancaster banking toward home. Moments later, the mission claimed its first real loss. A JB flown by Flight Sergeant Leslie Byers disappeared near the Dutch coast. Whether struck by enemy flak or victim to navigational error, the aircraft plunged into the sea. There were no survivors. Soon after, another blow. AJC, under the command of pilot officer William Barlow, was caught by flak near the Zuiderzee. Fire engulfed the bomber. It disintegrated mid-air. 3 aircraft gone, and not a single bomb dropped. The mission hung by a thread. The crews in the remaining aircraft could feel the weight of those losses. Comrades, friends, young men like themselves who had shared jokes, meals, and fears. But the discipline held. No one wavered. They pressed on through the night, skimming over forests, rivers, and sleeping villages, always alert for the flash of a searchlight or the bark of anti-aircraft guns. Shortly after midnight, the first dam loomed into sight. At exactly 0028 on the morning of May 17, 1943, Wing Commander Guy Gibson in Lancaster AJG made his final approach to the Möhne Dam. Below him lay the dark, glassy surface of the Möhne Reservoir, reflecting the moonlight like polished obsidian. The air was thick with tension. The surrounding hills funneled flak and fire into the narrow approach corridor. Searchlights stabbed at the night, hunting the intruders. German gunners on the dam's parapets opened up, filling the air with lethal tracer rounds that stitched orange-red lines through the darkness. But Gibson was unmoved. Flying at exactly 60 feet, steady hands on the controls, he called out calmly to his crew. His bomb aimer, Flight Lieutenant John Hutchinson, was hunched over his bomb sight, eyes locked on the converging spotlight beams that indicated the correct altitude. The upkeep bomb, already spinning beneath the fuselage, was primed and ready. At the last possible moment, Hutchinson gave the order. "Bomb gone!" The great steel drum tumbled free from the Lancaster's belly and skipped across the water's surface like a skipping stone. Once, twice, a third time. Then it struck the base of the dam and sank. A second passed. Then came the explosion, an immense underwater detonation that sent a geyser of water and concrete into the sky. The dam held. Staggered but not destroyed, the Möhne still stood, cloaked in smoke and lit by the fires of anti-aircraft bursts. Gibson circled back. His job wasn't finished. Over the next few minutes, he would guide other aircraft in like a conductor leading an orchestra of destruction, flying ahead of them, drawing enemy fire, and calling out instructions by radio. But in that moment, circling over the reservoir, watching flames lick at the water's edge, he knew one thing for certain: the impossible had begun. Another Lancaster swept in, then another and another. Gibson circled, drawing enemy fire, giving his comrades a fighting chance. Finally, on the fifth run, the dam cracked. Water exploded forth in a colossal plume. A wall of black water roared down the valley. The Möhne Dam was breached. Without pause, Gibson led the surviving aircraft toward the Eder Dam. This one lay deeper in the hills, with a narrow approach requiring hairpin turns and a dive between cliffs. It took over an hour and several failed approaches, but when AJM, flown by Les Knight, made his run, the bomb struck true. The Eder erupted in a churning maelstrom. A second dam had fallen. Meanwhile, the secondary team reached the Sorpe Dam, which had a different structure, an earth embankment rather than concrete. The bouncing bomb wouldn't work as intended. They adjusted, dropping it directly atop the dam. But not every dam fell. The Sorpe proved to be the most formidable target of all. Unlike the Möhne and Eder, it was not a concrete gravity dam, but an earth-filled embankment, requiring a direct, penetrating hit to achieve any meaningful breach. The valley it sat in was narrow and difficult to navigate, offering little room for a proper approach. Lancaster after Lancaster made their attempts, coming in low and steady, aiming by moonlight and hope. Bombs were dropped with surgical intent, but still the Sorpe held firm, absorbing the impact, shaking under the blasts, but refusing to yield. As dawn began to color the eastern horizon, the operation approached its end. The black sky lightened to a dusty gray. Fuel gauges dipped into the red. Some bombers, battered and running on fumes, turned back before releasing their payloads. They barely cleared the English Channel, their engines sputtering as they limped into base. Others never returned at all, cut down by flak, lost to navigation errors, or victims of sheer misfortune. One Lancaster crashed into a hill in the dark, its wreckage found days later. Others disappeared over occupied Europe, never to be seen again. Out of the 133 airmen who took off on the evening of May 16th, 53 did not come home. Young men, some barely out of school, Others, hardened by years of war, vanished into the night. Their loss was a brutal counterweight to the operation's success, a sobering reminder of the razor-thin line between valor and sacrifice. And yet, what they had achieved in those fleeting hours sent shockwaves through the heart of Nazi Germany. The Möhne Dam, struck with devastating precision, had released a cataclysm. Over 1.6 billion gallons of water exploded from its reservoir in a deafening roar, cascading down the Möhne Valley in a furious wave. The surge tore through towns and villages, swallowing everything in its path. Bridges were obliterated, railways twisted and buckled like string. Roads vanished beneath torrents of churning water. Entire factory complexes were drowned. Workers in industrial plants were swept away, their homes and livelihoods gone in moments. The Eder Dam collapse added to the devastation, sending floodwaters surging through the Fulda Valley. Hydroelectric plants were disabled. Smelters and armories were flooded. Communication lines were severed. The damage was immediate, physical, and psychological. Hundreds of civilians and forced laborers, many of them foreign workers brought to Germany under duress, perished in the floods. The Nazi leadership, stunned and furious, scrambled to contain the damage. Adolf Hitler was livid. Joseph Goebbels, the regime's propaganda minister, called it a cowardly act of terrorism, even as he quietly admitted its brilliance. Albert Speer, Germany's armaments minister, would later confess that the raid had an enormous psychological effect, far beyond the material destruction. It was proof that no place, no matter how deep inside the Reich, was safe. In Britain, the raid was hailed as a triumph of ingenuity, courage, and skill. Newspapers the next morning carried headlines of near mythical proportions. Guy Gibson, already a celebrated pilot, was awarded the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest military decoration for valor. The men of 617 Squadron became immortalized as the Dambusters, a name that would echo through military history. But behind the cheering crowds and glowing headlines lay a deeper, more nuanced reality. The survivors returned to Scampton exhausted, their faces drawn, many of them silent in the mess hall, processing what they had seen and what they had lost. The empty chairs at breakfast spoke louder than any medal. Gibson himself, though publicly lauded and sent on a propaganda tour, was never quite the same. He carried the burden of command and the memories of the raid like invisible weights. 16 months later, in September 1944, he would die when his Mosquito was shot down over the Netherlands. His body was found in a field, still inside the wreckage, far from the crowd-lined streets of his homecoming. Yet the legacy of the Dambusters endured. The raid had proven that precision bombing, once a theoretical concept, could be real, devastating, and strategically significant. It forced military planners on both sides to reconsider the vulnerability of infrastructure. Dams, power plants, bridges, no longer just auxiliary targets, but now understood as critical nodes in the enemy's war machine. For the Allies, the mission became a blueprint. Later operations would refine the techniques first pioneered over the Möhne. For the Axis, it was a wake-up call, sparking an urgent drive to strengthen air defenses, rebuild quickly, and harden key sites. The dams themselves were repaired within months, but the psychological fissure remained. In time, some critics would question the long-term value of the raid. They would argue that the strategic gains were short-lived, the flooding too brief, the factories soon operational again. But such assessments often overlooked what was achieved in spirit. The Dambusters Raid was not simply about destroying infrastructure, it was about demonstrating that the impossible could be done. With nothing more than slide rules, moonlight, and faith in their training, a group of young airmen had flown deep into enemy territory in low-level formation through radar and flak to drop a bomb no one had ever tested in combat against a target thought to be invulnerable. And they had done it, not for medals, not for glory, but because they believed that if they could breach the dam, they could breach the illusion of Nazi invincibility. Today, in the quiet hangars of RAF museums, a replica of the bouncing bomb sits in silence. Visitors gaze at it with awe, imagining it skimming over still waters, spinning fast and slamming into stone. They read the names of those who flew and died, and they remember a mission born from desperation, executed with brilliance and remembered in legend. And over the wooded hills of the Ruhr Valley, where once a wall of water rolled with fury, the memory lingers still. The flood has long since passed. The war is over. But in the echoes of history, the Dambusters still fly, low, fast, and unafraid.